The morning after the ball arrived with a peculiar quality of unreality, as though the entire evening had been something Eleanor had dreamed rather than lived. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. The silver gown hanging in her wardrobe still faintly scented with candle smoke and hothouse flowers, the sapphire necklace returned to its velvet case and waiting to be collected by Blackmore's footman, and the stack of calling cards that had begun accumulating on Sally's tray before Eleanor had even finished her morning tea. 23 already, ma'am, Sally reported, her eyes bright with vicarious excitement. And a boy just brought this. She held out a sealed envelope bearing the Blackmore crest. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she broke the seal. The note inside was characteristically brief. Tomorrow evening, the Ashworth Musicale. I will collect you at 7. Wear blue. And no pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the performance they had executed so flawlessly, just instructions delivered with the same certainty he brought to everything. Yet Eleanor found herself smiling despite the imperious tone. Wear blue, as though he had already inventoried her wardrobe and knew exactly what would serve their purposes best. She was still holding the note when a second messenger arrived, this one bearing a much larger package. Sally unwrapped it to reveal a gown of midnight blue silk, cut in the latest fashion with delicate pearl embroidery at the bodice and sleeves. A card tucked inside read simply, "In case you have nothing suitable." "Nothing suitable," Eleanor murmured, running her fingers over the exquisite fabric, "as though I own a wardrobe full of ball gowns and simply lack this particular shade." Yet beneath her wry amusement lay something more complicated. The gift was generous, practical, and yet another reminder of the vast gulf between their circumstances. Alistair could commission a gown as easily as he might order breakfast, while she had been wearing the same 3 dresses in careful rotation for months. The inequality of it should have rankled. Instead, she found herself touched by the care evident in every detail, the color chosen to complement her complexion, the style neither too young nor too matronly, the perfect fit that suggested he had paid very close attention to her measurements during their waltz. The day unfolded in a strange rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by reminders that her life had fundamentally shifted. She wrote thank-you notes to acquaintances whose names she barely remembered. She received a visit from Madame Rousseau, who arrived with additional accessories for the blue gown and cheerful gossip about how the entire city was talking about the Duke's engagement. She tried to focus on practical matters like reviewing the first documents related to the Derbyshire estate, but her attention kept drifting to the clock, counting down the hours until she would see Alistair again. By the time his carriage arrived the following evening, Eleanor had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation she refused to acknowledge. She descended the steps of her building to find him waiting beside the open carriage door, dressed in evening black that made him look like an elegant predator. His eyes travelled over her in a slow, assessing way that made her skin warm. "The blue was the right choice," he said simply, handing her into the carriage. "You might have asked rather than assumed," she replied, settling onto the velvet cushions. "Would you have refused?" He took the seat across from her, and even in the relatively spacious interior, his presence seemed to fill every available inch. "Probably not," she admitted, "which is precisely why you didn't ask." Something flickered in his expression, approval or amusement, or perhaps both. "You're beginning to understand how I operate." "I'm beginning to understand that you're accustomed to having your way in all things." She smoothed her gloves, affecting a calm she didn't entirely feel. "It must be refreshing to encounter someone who occasionally questions your methods." "Refreshing," he repeated, and there was a new warmth in his voice. "Yes, that's one word for it." The Ashworth Musicale proved to be an entirely different beast from the grand spectacle of the ball. Where Blackmore House had been all glittering surfaces and theatrical grandeur, the Ashworth Salon was intimate, refined, and filled with people whose power came not from titles, but from influence. Artists whose work shaped cultural conversations, writers whose essays swayed public opinion, and the kind of wealthy intellectuals who funded both political campaigns and social reform. Lady Ashworth herself greeted them at the door, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, who had been a noted beauty in her youth and remained formidable in her maturity. "Blackmore," she said with undisguised delight. "You actually came. And you brought your mysterious fiancé. My dear Lady Ravenshade, you must tell me how you managed what the rest of us could not." "I'm not entirely certain I managed anything, Lady Ashworth," Eleanor replied. "His Grace is rather good at getting what he wants. And what he wanted was you." Lady Ashworth's gaze was penetrating but not unkind. "How deliciously romantic. Come, you must meet everyone. We're having a proper literary evening tonight. Actual conversation, rather than the usual tedious posturing." She ushered them into a salon where perhaps 40 guests sat in small clusters, glasses of wine in hand, engaged in animated discussion. A quartet played softly in one corner, and the atmosphere was one of genuine intellectual engagement rather than social performance. Eleanor felt some of her tension ease. This was a world she understood. Her father had hosted similar gatherings at Derbyshire, evenings where ideas mattered more than titles. They were immediately absorbed into a conversation about German philosophy, then drawn into a debate about prison reform, then introduced to a young poet whose work Alice Dister had apparently been funding anonymously. Through it all, Eleanor watched him reveal facets of himself she hadn't suspected, a man who read widely, who could argue about Kant and Hegel with genuine passion, who listened to the young poet's nervous recitation with focused attention and offered criticism that was both honest and constructive. "You're surprised," he murmured, during a brief moment when they found themselves alone near the refreshment table. "I assumed your interest ran more toward ledgers and parliamentary votes," she admitted. "I contain multitudes," he said dryly. "Even dukes are occasionally permitted to think about things other than money and power." "And yet money and power are what brought us here tonight," she countered. "What are you really accomplishing by parading me through these gatherings?" His expression grew serious. "I'm showing certain influential people that I'm not the ruthless automaton they believe me to be, that I'm capable of connection, of caring about something beyond my own advancement." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I'm proving it to myself as well." Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by a man she recognized from the newspapers, Thomas Garrett, an investigative journalist whose articles had brought down more than one corrupt politician. He approached with the easy confidence of someone who knew his own worth and feared no one's rank. "Your Grace," Garrett said, inclining his head with minimal courtesy. "Lady Ravenshade, congratulations on your engagement. Quite sudden, wasn't it?" "Love often is," Alice Dister replied smoothly. "Indeed." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been doing some research into Lord Ravenshade's estate. Fascinating how his debts all seem to consolidate under your ownership just weeks before you announced this engagement, almost as though you engineered the entire situation." Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine. Beside her, Alice Dister's posture didn't change, but she sensed the shift in him, a coiling readiness like a predator preparing to strike. "Are you suggesting something, Garrett?" Alice Dister's voice was pleasant, almost bored. "I'm suggesting that the timing is remarkable. A widow in desperate circumstances, a powerful duke with political ambitions, a convenient romance that benefits both parties." Garrett shrugged. "It makes for an interesting story." "Then by all means write it," Eleanor heard herself say, surprising both men. "Write about how the Duke could have simply foreclosed on the property and taken it without any of this theatre. Write about how he could have any woman in England and chose a scandalous widow with nothing to offer but debts. Write about how terribly illogical it all is if one assumes we're both simply calculating machines rather than human beings capable of unexpected feeling." She held Garrett's gaze, refusing to look away first. "Or perhaps write about how a woman who survived 5 years of a brutal marriage might recognize genuine decency when she encounters it, even wrapped in a duke's arrogance. Either way, Mr. Garrett, I suspect your readers will believe what they wish to believe regardless of the facts you present." A long silence followed. Then Garrett's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "Well said, Lady Ravenshade. I can see why he chose you." He turned to Alice Dister. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, if this is a performance, it's the most convincing one I've ever witnessed." He walked away, leaving them standing together in the warm glow of candlelight, adrenaline slowly fading from Eleanor's system. "That was risky," Alice Dister said quietly. "That was necessary." She discovered her hands were trembling and clasped them together. If we appear defensive, we confirm his suspicions. Better to meet them head-on with a truth so disarming he doesn't know what to do with it. A truth? He turned to face her fully. Which part of what you said was truth, Eleanor? She met his eyes, and for a moment the room seemed to fall away. I'm no longer entirely certain, she admitted. Are you? Before he could answer, Lady Ashworth appeared to announce that the poet would be reading from his new collection. They took seats near the back of the salon, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The poet's words washed over Eleanor, something about winter and longing and the spaces between what is said and what is meant, but she barely heard them. Her entire awareness had narrowed to the man beside her, to the way his hand rested on the arm of his chair mere inches from hers, to the rhythm of his breathing, to the knowledge that they had just survived their first real test and emerged more entangled than before. When the reading ended and guests began to depart, Alcestis guided her toward the door with his hand at the small of her back, that now familiar touch that seemed to burn through layers of fabric. In the carriage, the darkness felt more intimate than before, charged with things they had almost said but didn't. Garrett will keep digging, Alcestis said as they rolled through the London streets. He's like a terrier with a bone, if he finds anything. He won't, Eleanor interrupted, because we're not giving him anything to find. We're simply a man and a woman who met under complicated circumstances and discovered something neither of us expected. She turned to look at him, his profile shadowed and sharp in the dim light filtering through the windows. That's the story we tell, because it's becoming more true every day. Is it? His voice was rough. You tell me, Your Grace. Are you still pretending? He was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the clatter of hooves and the distant calls of late-night vendors. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I stopped pretending somewhere between the waltz and the terrace. I'm not certain exactly when. Eleanor's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, far beyond the neat boundaries of their contract. They were supposed to maintain the fiction publicly, while keeping their hearts carefully separate. Yet here in the darkness, with London sliding past outside, and the end of their 2 weeks approaching like a cliff's edge, honesty felt like the only solid ground left. So did I, she confessed. The admission hung between them, enormous and terrifying. Alcestis reached across the space and took her hand, his grip warm and sure even through their gloves. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, weighted with acknowledgement rather than avoidance. When they reached her building, he walked her to the door as propriety demanded. On the threshold, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that lingered a moment longer than necessary. 3 more days of performances, he said. Then we're supposed to announce that we've had a change of heart. Yes. The word felt like ash in her mouth. What if we didn't? Eleanor's heart stuttered. What are you suggesting? He released her hand but didn't step back, his tall frame blocking out the street behind him. I'm suggesting that perhaps we should consider the possibility that this arrangement has become more than either of us intended. That walking away at the end of 2 weeks might be the most foolish thing we could do. That's not what we agreed to, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. No, but agreements can be renegotiated if both parties are willing. His eyes searched hers in the faint light from the street lamp. The question is, are you willing? Because I find myself... He stopped, seemed to gather himself. I find myself unable to imagine the alternative, going back to the way things were before I walked into your drawing room and made my proposition. I don't want to pretend you never happened, Eleanor. She should have been cautious. Should have reminded him of all the reasons this was impossible, the difference in their stations, the scandal it would cause to actually marry after engineering a fake engagement, the way society would devour her if they suspected the truth. Should have protected herself from the risk of believing in something that might still prove to be another form of trap. Instead, she said, I don't want that either. The relief that flooded his expression was so genuine, so unguarded, that it stole what remained of her breath. He raised his hand as though to touch her face, then seemed to remember where they were, who might be watching. His hand fell back to his side, but his eyes held promises of all the things propriety wouldn't allow. Then we'll find a way forward, he said. Together. Together, she echoed, and felt the word reshape the entire landscape of her future. For days afterward, that simple fact haunted Eleanor more than anything he had actually said. They had stood on the threshold of something that felt vast and terrifying and astonishingly fragile, and then parted with nothing more than words and a promise spoken beneath a London street lamp. No embrace, no stolen moment to anchor what they had admitted to each other. Only together, hanging between them like a vow and a challenge. Sleep that night was a lost cause. She lay awake listening to the muted noises of the city, staring up at the familiar cracks in her ceiling, while her mind replayed every nuance of his expression, every inflection of his voice. He had not spoken as a strategist bartering for advantage in Parliament, nor as a duke accustomed to acquiring what he pleased. He had spoken like a man standing on a precipice, fully aware of the height and still willing to look down. By morning, London had already moved on to dissect the more conventional details of their supposed romance. Sally brought up the breakfast tray with a breathless report of what the greengrocer had heard from a footman who worked for Lady Ashworth. "They say you and His Grace looked at each other last night, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist," the maid announced, placing the teapot down with unnecessary emphasis. "And Mrs. Havers down the street swears Lord Halifax himself was heard saying that if this is a performance, it's the finest he's ever seen." "Then let us hope he continues to think so," Eleanor replied, pouring tea with more steadiness than she felt. "Because if he decides otherwise, half of London will follow his lead." "Oh, I don't know, ma'am." Sally folded the napkin with an air of deep conviction. "Anyone with eyes can see there's more than pretending going on. A man like that doesn't look at a woman the way he looks at you unless—" She stopped, flushing. "Begging your pardon. It's not my place." "It's a good thing you're discreet and reserved, Sally," Eleanor said dryly. "Otherwise you might betray your opinions." The maid had the grace to laugh. "There's a note, ma'am, arrived not half an hour ago." The envelope bore the now familiar crest. Eleanor broke the seal, her heart kicking against her ribs in spite of herself. "There is something I must show you before we proceed any further. Be ready at 2. Wear something practical. A." "Practical," she murmured, staring at the firm strokes of his handwriting. "What on earth does a duke mean by practical?" "Not silk, I'd wager," Sally said. "Perhaps wool? Or that dark walking dress? The one that doesn't mind mud?" "Mud," Eleanor repeated, equal parts apprehensive and intrigued. "Where is he planning to take me that involves mud?" At precisely 2 o'clock, the Blackmore carriage pulled up not outside her building, but half a street away. When Sally drew back the curtain, Eleanor saw why. It was not the grand town coach with the ducal crest, emblazoned proudly on the door, but a more modest conveyance of glossy dark green with only the smallest discreet mark near the handle. He was waiting inside, hat brim pulled low, the stark planes of his face softened slightly by shadow. Gone were the bright diamonds and severe black he wore like armor to evening affairs. He wore instead a dark coat of plain but excellent cloth, the sort of garment a successful barrister or merchant might own, and his cravat was tied more simply than she had ever seen it. "You look very nearly respectable," she said as she settled opposite him. "One might almost mistake you for an ordinary man." "High praise indeed," he returned, knocking lightly on the roof. The carriage lurched into motion. "And you look exactly as I hoped you would." She glanced down at her own attire, the dark blue walking dress Sally had recommended, sturdy boots hidden beneath the hem, a simple bonnet that did not invite attention. Like a woman who expects mud. Like a woman prepared for reality. His gaze held hers, serious now. "These last days have been all chandeliers and champagne. Before we consider changing the nature of our agreement, you need to understand exactly what my world truly entails, not just the glittering parts." "Are you planning to disillusion me, Your Grace?" she asked lightly, though something in his tone prickled the back of her neck. "I'm planning to give you an honest choice," he said. "Something I should perhaps have done sooner." They left Mayfair behind, rolling through streets that grew narrower and dirtier as they went east. The neat stucco facades gave way to brick, the carefully swept pavements to cobbles, slick with refuse. The smell changed too, the crisp winter air, eating away at the cloying scents of perfume and coal smoke, replacing them with something raw. Coal still, but mixed with sewage and overcrowding and the sour tang of too many lives lived too close together. Eleanor watched children dart between carts with the reckless agility of those who had never known safe playrooms, saw women with tired eyes selling sprigs of wilting holly at corners, men in threadbare coats hunched against the cold. There were no carriages with crests here, only carts and barrows, and the occasional hired cab. Whitechapel, she realized aloud, recognizing the name from newspaper articles and whispered charity reports. What business brings a duke to Whitechapel? Obligations, he said simply. The carriage slowed, then stopped before a building that did not match its surroundings. Solid brick, freshly painted door, windows with unbroken glass. A brass plaque read, St. Margaret's Home for Women and Children, founded under the patronage of His Grace. The Duke of Blackmore. Eleanor turned to him, startled. This is yours. It's theirs, he corrected, nodding toward the door. But yes, I fund it. Come. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the sound of children's voices. A fire burned in a grate, in a moderately sized parlor, where several women sat sewing, while a group of little ones played with wooden blocks on a rug. Heads turned at their entrance, and a moment later a middle-aged woman in a plain but well-kept gown approached them with brisk steps. Your Grace. She curtsied, her manner respectful but not obsequious. We weren't expecting you today. Mrs. Holloway, this is Lady Ravenshade, Alcester said. My fiancée. Eleanor felt a strange flutter at the word spoken here, in this place so far from the settings where they had been performing their roles. Here, introduced to a woman who clearly knew him well, it sounded less like a script. I'm very pleased to meet you, Lady Ravenshade. Mrs. Holloway took her hand, her grip firm and warm. Any woman who can persuade this man to think of something other than financial statements and tariffs has my gratitude. I beg your pardon, Alcester said. I think about other things. Yes, Mrs. Holloway replied dryly, like work schedules, supply inventories, vaccination schedules, and which MPs need to be gently bludgeoned into supporting the next funding bill. Her gaze softened as she turned back to Eleanor. He's been coming here for 6 years. Founded the place when the mill owners refused to take responsibility for the girls they'd turned out onto the street. Eleanor looked around with new eyes. She saw the small details that spoke of long-term effort. The neat rows of cots through an open door, each with a clean quilt, the shelves of simple books, the faint lingering scent of carbolic beneath the coal smoke. What is this place exactly? She asked. A way station, Alcester answered, before Mrs. Holloway could. Some stay a night, some for months. Women who have nowhere else to go. Shopgirls dismissed when they become inconvenient. Wives fleeing men who think a fist is a marital right. Children who slip through every official crack. He glanced around, his jaw tightening for a moment. We can't save them all, but we save some. You founded this, she said slowly. Why? He hesitated. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. Because 10 years ago, a young woman I cared for very much married a man who broke her in every way a man can break a woman, and because there was nothing in the law that allowed me to help her without dragging her name through even greater ruin. Because I watched her disappear into a kind of darkness that no one with her pedigree was supposed to inhabit, and realized how little any of our grand words about honor actually meant. Lady Caroline, Eleanor guessed softly, remembering the seamstress's gossip. Something shuttered in his expression, the old instinct to conceal. But then, slowly, he nodded. She had fewer choices than everyone liked to pretend. As do you, in your way. As do they. He nodded toward a young woman entering with a child balanced on her hip, her dress worn but clean, her shoulders still hunched as though expecting a blow. It hit Eleanor then with full force. The careful construction of his offer to her, the contract, the clauses, the settlement promise if things went awry. He had not simply been shielding himself, he had been ensuring she would never be left with as few choices as Lady Caroline. You brought me here to show me this, she said, before I decide. I brought you here because if you truly become part of my life, this becomes part of yours. His gaze was steady, This and half a dozen other projects scattered from docksides to manufacturing towns. I'm not merely a man with a grand house and a seat in the Lords, Eleanor. I'm up to my neck in the machinery that keeps this country running and grinds too many people beneath its wheels. If you stay, you share that burden. She thought of Derbyshire, of quiet fields and familiar lanes, of the solace she'd imagined finding there after so many years of walking on eggshells. She had not pictured mill smoke and crying children and arguments with obstinate MPs over funding for clean water. It would be easier, she said slowly, to walk away at the end of 2 weeks. Take Derbyshire, retire to the country, and visit London only for the season. Yes, he agreed without hesitation, it would. In some ways it would be safer for you, quieter. And yet, she murmured, watching a little girl with a rag doll laugh as another child tried to snatch its hat, I have a feeling easier is not a word you have much regard for. Easier, he said with the ghost of a smile, rarely builds anything worth having. They spent the next hour touring the home. Mrs. Holloway explained intake procedures, funding challenges, the delicate balance of offering help without inviting the constable's too frequent visits. Eleanor asked questions, practical ones about staffing and supplies, sharper ones about how many women they had to turn away. And you do all this quietly, she said at last, as they stood near the door preparing to leave. Donations appear at committee meetings with no name attached. The plaque mentions only a title, not a man. Public benevolence is a currency like any other, he said. I already possess more influence than is comfortable. I'd rather this place take what it needs than have my name polished or tarnished by it. Still, she persisted, looking up at him, you chose to use that influence this way. You didn't have to. Something in his face softened, a tiny diminuendo she might have missed had she not been watching closely. It seemed, he said almost to himself, like a more satisfying way to wield a hammer. On the drive back, she was quieter than usual, turning everything over and over in her mind. Lady Caroline, the cold precision with which he structured agreements, the warmth with which the children had greeted him, clinging to his coat without fear, the way Mrs. Holloway had trusted him enough to argue respectfully about coal deliveries. You think less of me, he said, after a long stretch of silence, misreading her expression. Now that you've seen the grubby parts. No, her answer was immediate. If anything, I think more. It would be one thing to play the reformer from the safety of a drawing room. It is quite another to stand where we stood today and keep coming back. He studied her profile. And now that you have seen it, do you still not want the alternative? She turned to face him fully. You warned me about what your world truly entails, Alistair. Now allow me to be equally honest about mine. He stilled at the sound of his given name on her lips without title between them. I have been alone in too many rooms with men who believed my silence was guaranteed by their power, she said evenly. I have endured a marriage where my body, my thoughts, my very presence were treated as a kind of currency to be spent as my husband saw fit. I have sat across tables from men, lawyers and relatives alike, who spoke of my future as though I were a piece of furniture to be transferred. His hands had clenched on his knees, the leather of his gloves creaking. Eleanor! No, listen. Her voice remained steady. For the last 3 months, I have existed in a narrowing circle of choices. Poverty with a veneer of respectability, dependence on relatives who resent the obligation, or accepting the first reasonably respectable offer that came my way, regardless of affection. Then you appeared with an offer that was half lie, half salvation. It was a bad bargain in some ways, but it was my bargain. I signed that contract because, for the first time in a very long time, I was making a choice rather than having one made for me. And now? He asked hoarsely. Now you are offering something far more dangerous. She took a breath. You are asking me if I will choose not merely to survive, but to join you at the center of that machinery. To share a life built as much on responsibility as on comfort. To attach my fate to a man who is both capable of ruthless calculation and of founding homes like St. Margaret's. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Do you have any idea how tempting it would be to run to the country and never see another ledger or newspaper headline again? Yes, he said quietly. I can imagine it. She held his gaze. And yet, When I stood in that hallway and listened to those children, when I watched Mrs. Holloway talk to you like a general with her commander, when I saw your name on that brass plaque, for the first time since my father died, I thought, here is a kind of fight I might actually be proud to join. The silence that followed was not empty. It thrummed with possibility. So, Your Grace, she finished, if you are asking whether I am willing to renegotiate our agreement, my answer is this. I will not agree to a quiet, comfortable life in your shadow. But if what you are truly offering is a partnership, one where my mind and conscience matter as much as my presence at your side in a ballroom, then yes, I am willing. He exhaled as if he'd been holding that breath since the night of the ball. That is exactly what I am offering, he said. Clumsily, perhaps. Late, certainly. But that. Then, she said, allowing a small, genuine smile to curve her lips, we may have a new agreement to draft. His answering smile was unguarded, laced with something that felt suspiciously like joy. I thought you might say that. Peaton will be insufferably pleased. Mr. Peaton knows? He suspects, Alistair said. Lawyers always do. 2 days remained until the carefully orchestrated announcement of their mutual change of heart. Invitations had already gone out for a small supper at Lady Pembroke's townhouse, where the cream of their circle would gather, prepared to witness the elegant unraveling of a fairy tale. It had been planned with the same precision as the ball, the right observers, the right phrases, the right tone of dignified regret. You intend to disappoint them, Eleanor observed that evening as they sat together in his library, a room she'd seen only fleetingly before. Now, by the light of a single lamp in the fire, she saw it belonged not merely to a wealthy man, but to a man who read, shelves upon shelves of books, not for display but clearly handled, annotated, returned to. I intend, he said, pouring her a modest glass of port, to present them with a different story, one that may cause a stir, a scandal even, but a scandal of a useful sort. You intend to marry me, she corrected quietly, turning the glass between her fingers. Publicly. After staging a false engagement to gain political leverage, you realize that when someone finally connects all the threads, they will conclude, accurately, that you manipulated society for your own ends. I did, he said without flinching, and I will doubtless be called many unpleasant names for it. Ambitious, unscrupulous, calculating. He met her eyes. They will not be entirely wrong. They will also say I trapped you, that I clung so tightly to the role of Duchess-to-be that you were forced into honourable marriage rather than see me ruined. They will, he agreed, and some will believe it. Others will whisper that we planned it from the start, that I singled you out precisely because your circumstances made you the perfect player in my little drama. And those who know you best? She asked, unable to hide the raw edge of the question. He took a moment to answer. They will recognize that something in me changed, he said at last. Catherine suspects already. Halifax might yet be persuaded that affection and ambition are not mutually exclusive. A flash of wry humor lit his face. Garrett will write a scathing column that accidentally makes us folk heroes to half the city and villains to the other half. Comforting, she said, but some of the tension loosened in her chest. You make it sound like a chessboard you've already mapped to its final move. This isn't chess, he said softly. If it were, I'd have resigned the game the moment I realized my queen had ideas of her own. Queens do tend to, she returned, lifting her glass in a small salute. They spent the next hour not in embraces, not in declarations, but in the far more dangerous work of planning. How to restructure the announcement, which allies to tell beforehand, how to present their decision as something born out of the very scrutiny they had endured. If the engagement had begun as performance, then the second act would be about turning that performance into a kind of truth the world could live with. We say, Alistair proposed, pacing, that what began as an arrangement born of mutual convenience revealed deeper feeling than either of us expected, that in the very crucible of gossip and observation, we discovered that what we were pretending had become, to our alarm and delight, something real, Society adores a story about love winning out over calculation. And we omit the part where the calculation was your idea, Eleanor said, and where I signed a contract that would make any sensible chaperone faint. Naturally, he said, we gloss over the legalities and emphasize the transformation. I was a fortress. You were a widow determined never to wed without love again, and yet here we are, fools enough to try. Some would call it idiocy rather than courage, she mused. Most of the things worth doing in this life look like idiocy at first glance, he said. Founding homes in Whitechapel, proposing untested trade policies, asking a woman you barely know to pretend to be in love with you, and falling in love with her in truth, she said before she could stop herself. He froze. The words hung in the air between them, naked and irrefutable. You think I haven't? He asked, his voice low. You think this has been an amusing experiment in social engineering for me? Eleanor, I haven't slept more than 3 hours in a row since that afternoon in your drawing room. I find myself checking doorways for you the way a man once wounded checks windows for approaching enemies. I walk into rooms I have occupied 100 times before and think only of how you would see them. Color rose in her cheeks. You have a talent, she said, fighting for composure, for making even the most sensible woman forget her better judgment. Good, he said simply, because your better judgment is the only thing standing between us and happiness, or between us and disaster, she countered. Often the same thing, he replied. 2 days later, Lady Pembroke's dining room glittered with candlelight and expectation. Eleanor sat at Alistair's right, aware of every pair of eyes that turned toward them with feigned nonchalance. Lord Halifax sat 3 places down, his keen gaze missing nothing. Thomas Garrett had somehow secured an invitation under the flimsy pretense of writing about modern engagements among the aristocracy. Catherine Blackmore watched from across the table, her expression a mix of curiosity and something warmer. Dessert had just been served when Lady Pembroke, in the benevolent tone of a woman conducting business on behalf of society itself, said, "Well, Blackmore, we are all agog. You've kept us in suspense long enough. I trust you are prepared to tell us whether we shall be ordering wedding gifts or condolences." A murmur of laughter rippled around the table. Every head turned. Alistair rose, the movement unhurried, deliberate. He rested his fingertips lightly on the back of his chair, the picture of relaxed authority. "Lady Pembroke," he said, "friends. When I first approached Lady Ravenshade with the idea of an engagement, I did so with motives that, while not dishonourable, were certainly complex." A rustle at that, and more than one sharply raised eyebrow. "I have ambitions for this country," he continued, "for its trade, for its laws, for the way it treats those it has too often ground underfoot. Those ambitions require alliances, appearances, stability. It seemed to me that contract and calculation would serve those ends better than anything so volatile as love." Eleanor felt the room sharpen around them, like a lens coming into focus. Halifax's gaze had turned flinty. Garrett's pen hovered above his notebook. "It also seemed," Alistair went on, "that Lady Ravenshade's situation and mine could be mutually improved by an arrangement founded on clarity rather than illusion. She would gain security and the restoration of property that was rightfully hers. I would gain a partner whose intelligence and resilience were equal to the battles ahead." So far, it was not so different from the truth. Eleanor kept her spine straight, her expression composed, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What I did not anticipate," Alistair said, and now his eyes sought hers, dark and steady, "was that in the very act of performing this arrangement for you all, under your watchful eyes, subject to your kind scrutiny and less kind speculation, we would find ourselves transformed by it." A collective intake of breath. Someone's spoon clinked against a plate. "We set out to persuade you that we were in love," he said. "In the process, we discovered that we had quite efficiently deceived ourselves." A ripple of startled laughter quickly stifled. "Lady Ravenshade has every reason to be wary of marriage," he continued, his voice gaining gravitas. "She has known what it is to be a wife in name and a commodity in truth. She agreed to our arrangement on the strictest of practical terms. So did I. But in these last weeks, under the relentless theatre of your ballrooms and drawing rooms, in more private places as well," His gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly. "We have found something neither of us planned upon. Affection, respect, partnership." He extended his hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture that was simultaneously courtly and deeply personal. "My friends," he said, not looking at any of them, only at her, "I told you once that I was waiting for a woman who wanted me for myself, not my title. I am, as it happens, very far from easy to want. I am stubborn, frequently arrogant, occasionally insufferable. I excel at making enemies and am execrable at small talk." Soft laughter again. "Yet Lady Ravenshade has looked at all that and still chosen to stand beside me. I find that astonishing. I find it humbling." Something in his expression, unfeigned vulnerability in a man so controlled, stole her breath. "If she is willing," he said, his voice quieter now but carrying clear to every corner of the room, "I would like to set aside the pretense of an arrangement and ask her, not as a duke managing his estates, but as a man whose life she has unmade and remade in ways he did not know he needed." He paused. The room leaned forward as one. "Eleanor, will you marry me? Not for convenience, not for the sake of Parliament or property, but because we have somehow recklessly managed to fall in love." There it was, flung before the most critical witnesses they could have assembled. He had taken their secret and set it ablaze in the very place that could have destroyed them. Eleanor rose slowly, aware that every movement would be dissected by breakfast. The world beyond the table blurred at the edges. There was only Alistair's face, the tightness at the corners of his mouth betraying tension, the way his usually steady hands were not quite entirely still. "You have," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You have a truly appalling habit, Your Grace, of making decisions that affect entire nations with less apparent anxiety than you show in this moment." Nervous titters from the table. "But since we are being honest," she continued, her gaze never leaving his, "I should confess that when I accepted your original proposition, it was with every intention of leaving you at the end of our appointed span, property intact, heart untouched. You were, to my mind, a useful devil, a dangerous man whose aims happened for once to intersect with my own." She heard the sharp intake of breath at devil, saw Lady Pembroke's eyes widen. "Then," she said, "you insisted on confusing matters. You founded homes in Whitechapel. You argued passionately for prison reform. You remembered which poets I loved and which I could not abide. You treated my mind as though it were an asset rather than an inconvenience. You listened when I disagreed with you. You told the truth even when lies would have served you better in the moment." She saw it again, the flicker of something raw in his expression. Around them, the room had gone absolutely still. "So yes," she said, and now a small incredulous smile curved her mouth. "In the process of convincing everyone else that we were in love, you succeeded in convincing me as well. Against my better judgment, against every vow I made after my first marriage, that I would never again trust a man with more power than conscience." She reached out and laid her hand in his open palm, the contact oddly simple after all they had already shared. "So, Alistair Blackmore," she finished, the use of his name without title a declaration in itself, "if you are truly asking me to choose this knowing all that it entails, your work, your enemies, your stubbornness, your ambition, then my answer is yes. I will marry you, and God help you if you attempt to conduct our marriage on the same terms as a trade agreement." Laughter burst around the table, a sound edged with relief and excitement. Someone began to clap, others joined. Glasses were lifted, toasts began to form. The entire room surged into that peculiar frenzy that overtook society when presented with a story that hit all their favorite notes. Scandal flirted with, love triumphant, a powerful man brought metaphorically to heel by an intelligent woman. But in the center of it, Alistair lifted her hand to his lips, and the rest of the world faded again. "God help anyone who attempts to pit themselves against you," he murmured, "just for her. I've just publicly allied myself with the most formidable woman in London." "You have," she agreed. "It's far too late to repent now." "Repent?" he echoed. "Never. I intend to face Parliament tomorrow with a very smug expression and the knowledge that I have just made the best political and personal decision of my life. "And if Halifax still doubts your motives?" she asked. "As of this evening," came a dry voice from their left, "Halifax no longer has that luxury." They turned to find the man himself standing near, glass in hand, his expression for once unguarded. "I have watched you maneuver men for a decade, Blackmore," he said. "I have seen you lie beautifully, and tell the truth even more beautifully when it suited your purposes. But I have never seen you look at anything the way you just looked at Lady Ravenshade. If this is artifice, it is of a kind beyond mortal comprehension." His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "And you, madam, just shamed half this room with your clarity. I look forward with interest to seeing what mischief the two of you make together." "Is that your blessing?" Alistair asked, only half in jest. "It is my acknowledgement," Halifax said, "and my promise that when your trade bill comes up next week, I will not oppose it solely on the grounds that you are an arrogant bastard. I shall read the actual text." "In our world," Alistair murmured to Eleanor as Halifax moved away, "that counts as a love sonnet." "Then we are well launched," she replied. Later, when the toasts had been drunk, and the whispers had begun their inevitable spread through drawing rooms and back corridors, when Lady Pembroke had declared the evening the most diverting of the season, and Garrett had vanished with a face full of stories, they found themselves at last in the relative quiet of the Blackmore carriage. For once neither spoke at first. They sat side by side rather than facing each other, the better to feel the slight sway of their shoulders aligning with each turn. Outside, London gleamed in its winter finery, unaware or uncaring that the fates of two of its residents had just irrevocably shifted. "It is done," Eleanor said at length, the words half disbelief, half wonder. "No going back now." "No," Alistair agreed. "No going back." He turned his head to look at her, his expression unusually solemn. "If at any point you begin to regret—" "I will tell you," she interrupted, firmly, possibly with thrown objects. "Fair," he conceded. A faint smile touched his lips. "And if at any point you feel I am beginning to treat you like an asset rather than a partner, I will draw up a new contract," she said, "one with truly draconian penalties." He laughed then, the sound rich and unguarded. "Marry me quickly, Eleanor, before I forget that I am supposed to be the terrifying one in this arrangement." "Too late," she murmured. And this time, when he reached for her, there was no street lamp, no curious neighbors, no thin layer of propriety to stop him. He cupped her face between his hands as though it were something both precious and powerful. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, everything they had risked and everything they stood to gain balanced in the space between them. Then he kissed her. It was not the possessive claiming she had once feared from men with power, nor the practiced seduction she had braced herself to deflect. It was something far more dangerous, a careful, reverent question from a man not accustomed to asking them, an acknowledgement that she could still, even now, say no. She did not. The first brush of his mouth against hers stole the air from her lungs. The second gave it back, changed. When they parted, the city had not altered. Parliament still waited with its ledgers and laws. The debts of half of England still hung like millstones, but the landscape of her life had been irrevocably redrawn. "Together," he said again, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "Together," she answered, and this time the word was not a hope or a plan or even a promise. It was a beginning. They married on a grey April morning that promised rain and delivered sunshine instead. The chapel attached to Blackmore House had seen its share of christenings and funerals, political alliances sealed, and dynasties continued, but rarely such a carefully measured balance of grandeur and intimacy. Alistair had insisted on that balance, arguing with the family steward over every guest on the list, trimming away the merely curious in favour of those whose presence truly mattered. "It is not a spectacle," he had said bluntly when Lady Pembroke tried to press for an extra 50 invitations. "It is my wedding." "It is London's wedding," she had retorted. "We have all invested in this drama. The least you can do is let us see the final act." "In this particular play," he replied, "the final act is not for you." In the end, they compromised. The chapel was full but not crowded. The King's cousin attended as a nod to the Crown's approval of his trade bill. Several members of the opposition came out of equal parts curiosity and strategic necessity. Lord Halifax stood with a wry half-smile near the front, bearing witness as though this too were legislation to be tested. Mrs. Holloway had been given a seat among the dowager duchesses and titled matrons, where she sat bolt upright and refused to be intimidated by lace or jewels. Eleanor waited in the small antechamber with Catherine and Sally, her hands steady, not because she felt no nerves, but because they had settled into something calmer and fiercer than mere anxiety. Fear had walked with her to the threshold of this day, pointed out every possible disaster. A husband turning cold once the vows were said, a life swallowed by obligation, a slow erosion of the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. But beside that fear walked memory, of Alistair in the crowded parlour at St. Margaret's cradling a feverish child, of his face when she had said yes at Lady Pembroke's table, of the precise way he listened when she spoke of Derbyshire's tenants as though their names mattered as much as any minister's. "Are you certain about the flowers?" Catherine asked, fussing with the small bouquet. "They are perfect," Eleanor said, looking down at the simple cluster of white lilacs and green leaves. "My mother loved lilacs, and they smell like the country." "They smell," Catherine said, inhaling deeply, "like someone is actually happy to be here, which makes you rather a rarity." She was half jesting, half not. The last 3 aristocratic weddings Catherine had attended had been exercises in quiet despair, pale brides with eyes like trapped birds, grooms working out in real time how this union advanced their careers. "And you?" Eleanor asked. "Are you happy?" Catherine's expression softened. "I'm delighted," she said simply. "I've watched my brother build walls out of ledgers and treaties for years. I didn't think anyone would manage to climb them, much less convince him to help take them down." Sally sniffed noisily and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I'll have you know, ma'am, that not everyone thought he'd do right by you." "I know," Eleanor said, and reached out to squeeze the maid's hand. "You certainly didn't." "I told him so to his face," Sally said, chin lifting, "and he told me if he ever hurt you, I had his permission to strike him with the coal scuttle." Eleanor blinked. "He said that?" "He did," Catherine confirmed, laughing outright now, "and I have never loved him more." The chapel bells began to toll. The sound rolled through the stone corridors, gathering them up. When Eleanor stepped into the aisle, time seemed to contract. She was aware of everything in sharp detail, and yet of nothing but the man waiting at the other end. The rustle of silk as she moved, the faint scent of beeswax from the candles, the glint of the Blackmore crest worked into the kneeling cushions. Alistair stood at the altar in evening black, a white rose in his lapel, no jewellery beyond the simple signet ring he always wore. He did not look like England's most formidable political operator in that moment. He looked like a man stripped down to the essence of himself, proud, a little stunned, completely focused on her. Later, she would not remember the exact words of the service. The familiar language washed over them, forsaking all others, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer. And each phrase lodged in a different part of her, the widow who had known sickness and poverty, the woman who understood just how wealthy he was and how precarious that wealth could be when tied to conscience. "Will you have this man," the clergyman intoned, "to thy wedded husband to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony?" Eleanor met Alistair's eyes and said clearly, "I will." His answering, "I will," came with the faintest tremor, like a man signing a treaty he had fought for and feared in equal measure. When he slid the ring onto her finger, a band of gold, its only ornament a tiny engraving of intertwined ravens and wheat, his hand steadied. With each vow, the Duke of Blackmore took on another layer of obligation, this time not to Parliament or Crown, but to the woman before him. "You may kiss the bride," the clergyman said. The chapel held its breath. Alistair lifted her veil with careful fingers. For an instant they were alone in a space carved out of time, the weight of watching eyes suspended. He did not devour her, did not claim, did not perform. He kissed her with a quiet reverence that made Eleanor's throat tighten, as if he were sealing not only a union, but a promise. To remember this gentleness when tempers flared and politics intruded. The congregation erupted in murmurs and applause. Somewhere Lady Pembroke wept into an embroidered handkerchief. Lord Halifax cleared his throat suspiciously. Garrett, lurking near the back, scribbled furiously in a notebook, already composing the lines that would frame this marriage for those who had not been invited to witness it. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of carriage wheels and speeches, toasts both heartfelt and ridiculous. The king's cousin made a comment about modern marriages built on mutual respect, which half the room heard as endorsement and the other half as criticism. Catherine gave a short, unexpectedly moving speech about two stubborn people finding their match. Mrs. Holloway raised a glass of plain claret and declared that if the Duke expected her to pretend she had not seen him up to his elbows in coal dust, he was sorely mistaken. Through it all, Eleanor and Alistair moved as a unit, never far from one another, moving in tandem with a naturalness that grew hour by hour. There were still sharp glances exchanged over an overbold joke, small frowns when a guest stepped too close, but beneath all that pulsed a steady undercurrent of familiarity. They had spent weeks rehearsing a version of this closeness. Now they were learning the unchoreographed steps. It was not until late that evening, when the last guest had departed and the last footman had drawn the last curtain, that they found themselves alone in the room that had been prepared for them. The ducal bedchamber was grand without being ostentatious. High ceilings, heavy curtains, a fire banked low in the grate. Eleanor had half expected some echo of her first wedding night to rise up and choke her, some memory of fear or resignation. Instead, she felt a kind of careful anticipation, like standing on the threshold of a new wing in a familiar house. Alistair stood near the window, his back to her, hands braced on the sill. The moon laid a pale path across the polished floor. "You're very quiet," she said, closing the door behind her. "I am," he agreed. He did not turn at once. "I am trying to find the exact words to ask if you are all right without suggesting I expect you not to be." "An admirable attempt," she said. "You may ask." He turned then, and in his face she saw none of the practiced confidence he wore in public. He looked like a man who knew the importance of this night and also knew how badly men could fail women in it. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "are you truly all right?" She crossed the room to him, her skirts whispering over the floor. "I am," she said. "Not unafraid, but not of you." "What then?" His hand, when she took it, was warm and very steady. "Of the size of it all," she admitted, "of what we've set in motion, of waking tomorrow and discovering this was all a fever dream and I am still in Bloomsbury arguing with Mr. Peaton about my widow's portion. I can arrange for Mr. Peyton to appear at dawn," he offered gravely, "as a test." "Please don't," she said, laughing in spite of herself. "He would bring ledgers." His thumb brushed the back of her hand. "If at any moment tonight, or any night, you wish me to stop, you need only say so. Or not say. I will not ever—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "That is precisely why I am not afraid of you." She reached up then and laid her palm against his cheek. The roughness of faint stubble beneath her fingers grounded her. This was not a symbol or an idea. This was a man, fallible and fierce, choosing and being chosen. "Alistair," she murmured, "I have spent enough years of my life having things done to me. Tonight, I would rather like to be a participant." Something like awe flickered through his expression. "You continue," he said hoarsely, "to be most inconveniently remarkable." "Get used to it," she replied, and drew him down to her. What passed between them then was private and imperfect and deeply human. There were moments of hesitancy, of laughter when pins refused to come loose from her hair, of tenderness that made her chest ache. There were also flashes of something fiercer, something that had always burned beneath their arguments and bargains, now given a place to exist without pretense. In the quiet afterwards, with the fire low and the first hint of dawn pale against the curtains, Eleanor lay with her head on his shoulder and listened to the slow, steady beat of his heart. It sounded nothing like the ticking of a clock, nothing like the scratching of a pen over vellum. It sounded like a man at rest for the first time in longer than he could likely remember. "Do you regret it?" he asked into her hair, the question careful. She considered. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again when Parliament convenes." He snorted softly. "By then, I shall be too busy regretting that I introduced you to Garrett and Halifax. You will have me outnumbered in every committee." You did say you wanted a partner, she reminded him, not a decorative appendage. I did, he said, tightening his arm around her. God help me, I did. Marriage did not, as society liked to pretend, resolve everything neatly. It merely set the stage for new complications. The morning after their wedding, while half of London still nursed champagne headaches, Eleanor sat at the long breakfast table with ledgers spread out before her. Not Blackmore accounts, those she would approach cautiously layer by layer, but Derbyshire's. It seems, she said, tapping a column of numbers, that the last steward my father employed was either very careless or very clever at disguising embezzlement. Alistair, who had come in expecting perhaps a gently dreamy bride, and found instead a woman with ink on her fingers and a pin holding back a strand of hair, poured himself coffee and leaned over her shoulder. Careless, he said after a quick scan. A clever thief would not leave such obvious discrepancies. Comforting, she murmured. We are being robbed by mediocrities. Not any more, he replied. May I? At her nod, he took a seat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For the next hour they worked through the figures together. He explained which fluctuations could be accounted for by crop failures or market changes, which were likely signs of mismanagement. She explained which families had farmed which parcels for generations, which names in the margins were those of widows trying to hold on to their cottages. This, he said at one point, resting his finger on a line item, is going to cost us. Us? She repeated quietly. He glanced sideways at her. I do not draw neat little boxes around my responsibilities, Eleanor. Your land is your own. But if we decide that forgiving back rent or investing in new drainage is the right course, that decision affects our household too. I would rather we shoulder those costs together. Then we need to distinguish between those who cannot pay and those who will not, she said, relief and something warmer unwinding in her chest. Charity without discernment merely teaches people to expect rescue. He smiled slowly. You really are going to be terrible for my reputation as an unfeeling tyrant. On the contrary, she said, we shall make you far more efficiently terrifying. That afternoon she accompanied him to the Lord's chamber for the first time, taking her place in the gallery reserved for ladies. Below, in their red and ermine, the peers gathered like a flock of dangerous birds. She watched Alistair move among them, noting who inclined their heads, who turned away pretending not to see him, who greeted him with wary cordiality. The trade bill he had fought so hard to shape was up for serious debate at last. Eleanor listened as men rose to praise or condemn it, some out of genuine conviction, others because they had debts to protect or donors to please. She noted which phrases made Halifax's eyes sharpen, which arguments Garrett, perched in the press gallery, scribbled down. When Alistair's turn came, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. Love him or hate him, none could afford to ignore him. My lords, he began, we are very good in this country at insisting that things remain as they are, so long as those things benefit us. There were murmurs at that, some offended, some appreciative. We speak of stability as though it were a moral quality, as though to alter any arrangement is to invite chaos. But stability purchased at the cost of other men's lives is not stability, it is stagnation. And stagnation, as any physician will tell you, breeds rot. He spoke not merely of tariffs, but of the web of human lives those tariffs touched. Dockworkers on the Thames, weavers in Prussia, children in Whitechapel factories. He spoke, to Eleanor's surprised pride, of St. Margaret's, not by name, but by type, describing the women and children who ended up there as the inevitable result of policies crafted without imagination. We sit in this chamber, he said, and speak as though the only measures of consequence are profit and precedence. I suggest we add a third, the cost to the souls of those who must live with the consequences of our comfort. It was a dangerous argument, appealing not to self-interest, but to conscience, yet when he sat, there was no immediate rush to tear him apart. Even his enemies seemed momentarily uncertain, as if he had moved the terms of engagement half a step to the side. From her seat in the gallery, Eleanor felt something akin to what she had felt walking into the ball with him on her arm, the hum of a room recalibrating itself around a new center of gravity. Only this time, the performance was not a deception. It was an amplification of truth. When debate adjourned for the day and the peers spilled into corridors lined with portraits of their predecessors, she descended to meet him. He was surrounded at once by allies and skeptics, everyone wanting a word, a promise, a concession. She waited, speaking quietly with Catherine and nodding to Mrs. Holloway, who had come in her plainest gown and sat among duchesses as if she had every right, which, Eleanor reflected, she did. Alistair broke free at last, coming to her with that faintly dishevelled look he always acquired when he had been in close quarters with too many politicians. "Well?" he asked. "Do I still have a job?" "For the moment," she said, taking his arm. "Halifax's expressions suggest he has upgraded you from necessary evil to irritant of principle." "Progress," he said. "I shall embroider it on a cushion." "Do," she replied. "I have some spare lilac silk that would look very well in your office." He glanced toward the gallery. "What did you think?" "That," she said, "for a man who claims to be entirely motivated by cold calculation, you have a very inconvenient tendency to tell the truth, even when it costs you." He made a non-committal sound. "And strategically?" "Strategically," she said, lowering her voice, "I would suggest you speak to Lord Caversham about the clause regarding Prussian textiles. His son has investments there he has not disclosed. If you offer a slight amendment—" He stared at her. "When did you become aware of Caversham's investments?" "When we visited his wife last week," she said. "She wears her irritation on her sleeve, and on her drapes. Those new curtains in the north drawing-room were paid for with foreign profits. I would stake Derbyshire on it." Alistair threw back his head and laughed, startling several bishops. "Eleanor," he said, "remind me never to hide anything from you. You would ruin me." "On the contrary," she replied, "I intend to ensure you flourish. It will make my own life considerably more comfortable." Not all battles were fought in grand chambers. Some took place in drawing-rooms over tea, where dowagers grilled her about producing an heir, some in quiet evenings, when Alistair returned late, shoulders bowed under the day's weight. There were quarrels too. He was not, it turned out, infallible at home any more than in politics. One rainy evening, she found him in his study with 3 letters spread before him, each from a different mill owner threatening to withdraw support for his bill if he persisted in pressing for child labour restrictions. "If I concede on this point," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose, "I keep their votes for the broader measure, which will, in the end, do more overall good. And in the meantime," she said, arms folded, "children continue to crawl under machines until their hands are crushed." "It is not that simple," he snapped, then immediately winced. "Forgive me, that was unfair." "No," she said, "it is revealing." He looked up sharply. "You built your influence," she continued, "on being the man who could see every 10 moves ahead, who refused to be swayed by sentiment. That has allowed you to accomplish things softer men would not survive. But it also tempts you, Alistair, to believe that any compromise you make is justified by the brilliance of your endgame." "You would rather I lose everything by standing firm on every particular?" he demanded. "That I go down in history as a man of magnificent principles who accomplished nothing?" "I would rather," she said quietly, "that you remember every principle you bend has a face, a name, a body that bears the cost." They stared at each other across the desk, the fire throwing shifting shadows over the shelves of books. "You accuse me," he said slowly, "of becoming the kind of man I oppose." "I remind you," she replied, "of the kind of man you told me you wanted to be." Silence stretched. He looked down at the letters, then back at her. "When I stood in that chapel," he said at last, "and promised to love and honor you, I did not fully account for the fact that honoring would occasionally involve being forced to examine my own justifications. I am delighted to be so educational," she said, though her voice had softened. He exhaled and pushed the letters aside. "Very well. I hold the line on the children. If they withdraw their support, we find other paths." "It will be harder," she warned. "Many worthwhile things are." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "As you have frequently reminded me." She came around the desk then, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. "I do not ask you to be a martyr, Alistair, only to ensure that when you trade one thing for another, you do not become like those men who once drove you to rage. "You keep comparing me to my enemies," he said, tilting his head back to look up at her. "It is most motivating." "It is intended to be," she replied. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, the gesture both apology and thanks. "Very well, my conscience," he said. "Let us go upstairs before I am tempted to appease you by promising to retire to Derbyshire and raise sheep." "Tempting," she murmured. "But no. You would bully the sheep into forming a union and then propose legislation on their behalf." He laughed again, tension easing. Seasons turned. Scandals rose and fell, some touching them, most not. The city remained what it had always been, a beast of light and shadow, devouring some, elevating others, indifferent to the fates of individual hearts. Eleanor found ways to carve out space within it that was hers and not merely Blackmore's. She took an active role at St. Margaret's, working with Mrs. Holloway to establish an education program for the women who passed through. She shocked more than one matron by insisting on visiting a prison to observe conditions firsthand before supporting one of Alistair's reform proposals. "You will be the ruin of my carefully cultivated image," he complained one evening, after a particularly pointed caricature in the newspapers showed the Duchess of Blackmore dragging her husband by the ear toward a workhouse. "I notice," she said, "that the artist depicted you walking willingly." "Artistic license," he muttered. "They have at least stopped depicting me as a tragic victim," she observed. "Half the pamphlets now present me as either a scheming enchantress or a terrifying reformer. It is progress." "It is," he said thoughtfully. "I had not realized how much easier it is to address outrage when it is directed at both of us rather than at you alone." "Shared scandal," she said, "the truest form of marital unity." They returned to Derbyshire together that autumn, not as a refuge from the world, but as a place to think, to recalibrate. The estate bore scars of neglect, but also signs of resilience. Fields that had recovered once fair rents were restored, cottages with new roofs, children who ran to greet them with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of those who had only ever known this as home. Standing on the hill where her father had once shown her the boundaries of their land, Eleanor felt the full arc of her journey, from protected daughter to commodity wife to desperate widow to something else entirely. "Do you miss the quiet life we might have had if I had never sent that letter?" Alistair asked, coming to stand beside her. She looked out over the patchwork of fields, the river catching late sunlight, the distant figures of tenants finishing the day's work. "I miss my father," she said honestly. "I miss the illusion I once had that the world could be divided neatly into safe and dangerous places. And now, she said, I know that safety is not a place, but a set of people. And that danger follows wherever power is hoarded without question." She glanced up at him. "Also that dukes have a regrettable tendency to appear at solicitors' offices when least expected." He smiled. "If I had not acquired those debts, someone else would have. Someone with far less scruple and far less irritating charm," she allowed. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever resent," he asked carefully, "how it began? That I put you in a position where saying yes seemed like the only rational choice?" She considered. "Sometimes," she admitted. "In the small hours, when memory is sharpest, I think of the letter from Mr. Peaton and your first visit, and I am angry with both of you. Angry that I had to sign a contract to secure what should have always been mine. Angry that you calculated how desperate I was." He flinched slightly, but did not look away. "And then?" "And then," she said, "I remember sitting in your carriage before the ball, making up our story, and realizing that you were listening to me as if my thoughts mattered. I remember Whitechapel. I remember you standing in front of a room full of men who would rather not have been reminded of their souls and doing it anyway." She took his hand. "I remember the man you have been every day since, not only the one you were at the beginning. That man," he said softly, "exists in part because you agreed to that devil's bargain." "Then let us call it even," she replied. They stood together in comfortable silence, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. A kestrel wheeled far above, indifferent to human entanglements. "You know," Alistair said at length, "Halifax told me last week that Garrett's latest column referred to us as that most dangerous of things, a marriage that functions as a government in miniature." Eleanor laughed. "High praise indeed." He meant it as a warning, Alistair said, to others and perhaps to us. Then we had better live up to it, she replied. If our dinner table can survive arguments over tariffs and tenant rights, perhaps Parliament has hope. He brought her hand to his lips. You continue, he said, to make empire building sound like a joint household expense. It is, she said. We pay for it in time and attention and sleep and occasionally reputation. We might as well ensure we like the thing we are buying. He laughed again, that rare, unguarded sound that still pleased her every time she heard it. Very well, Lady Blackmore, let us spend it wisely. Let us, she agreed. Years later, when their story had already begun to harden into anecdote in the mouths of others, when young debutantes whispered about the widow who caught the untouchable duke and hardened politicians muttered about the day love had apparently invaded the lords, Eleanor would sometimes wake before dawn and lie listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing beside her. She would think of all the small decisions that had led to this, the moment she had insisted on a contract, the instant he had decided to acquire her husband's debts, the breath between "I don't want that either" and "together." The world would continue to embroider their tale. It would smooth away the sharp edges, turn legal papers into love letters, reduce complex political maneuvers to a single romantic waltz. People preferred their stories tidy, but in the quiet, honest spaces of their life, the shared glances over parliamentary reports, the tired smiles after a long day at St. Margaret's, the arguments that sharpened them both rather than wore them down, they knew the truth. They had not been saved by fate or by some benign universe that rewarded virtue at last. They had saved themselves and each other by choosing again and again to step toward rather than away, by renegotiating agreements, by holding each other to the best versions of themselves, by refusing to let fear or convenience dictate the terms of their union. One particularly stormy night, when wind rattled the panes and distant thunder grumbled like an old peer voicing disapproval, Eleanor turned to Alistair in the dim light of the banked fire. "Do you ever think," she asked, "of how things might have gone if I had said no that first day?" "Frequently," he said. "Usually when Halifax is being particularly insufferable. I imagine myself with a simpler life, fewer arguments, less public vilification." "And?" she prompted. "And then," he said, "I imagine myself without you. And I'm immediately grateful that you had the appalling bad sense to sign that contract." "Appalling bad sense," she repeated. "Is that what we are calling it now?" "We are calling it," he said, gathering her closer, "the single finest miscalculation I ever made." She smiled against his shoulder. "And your most profitable. In all currencies that matter," he replied. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, in the house of a man who had once believed he could manage his life as he did his ledgers, two people slept without illusion, without pretense and without regret, not because their story had been perfect, but because they had chosen again and again to write it together. And so ends the story of Eleanor and Alistair, two souls who transformed a cold arrangement into true love. If this journey touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next historical romance stories. Comment below, do you believe love can be born from a calculated beginning until the next story? The end.